My name is Pat Baird. I work at Philips in lots of standards and regulatory sorts of things around software. And I've, over the past year or so, had the pleasure of working with these other panelists in developing some articles for publication, as well as the consensus report that we had mentioned, et cetera. So as we were putting together the agenda for today's presentations, we thought, you know, it would be really nice to have just an open panel discussion about a couple particular topics, and we can see if that would get attendees' brain going and come in with questions for us. We're going to have a big Q&A at the end of all of this, and we know there's some commonly asked questions that we've come across, and we wanted to try to address at the panel, as well as some other things just to get people thinking. So I think I'd like to kick it off in talking about best practices. I'm used to, when I'm writing a guidance document, when I'm writing a internal procedure or working on a standard, it's all about best practices. It's all about how to be really good at what you're doing. And what I want to ask the panel is, because clouds still seem to be evolving a bit, are we there yet? Are we really at the point of best practices? Or, you know, are there things that people should be doing as compared to things that people really must be doing, shall be doing? Where is it? Where do the panelists feel the current state of the art is? Is it mature and stable, or are we going to have some more changes?
That's a good question. I'll take the first look at it. So I think one of the fundamental issues here is, you know, in general computing is evolving really and changing and continuing to mature and get more complex and more sophisticated and more reliable, but we're getting less and less control. And that's the sort of the constant trade-off that we've had even before the cloud came on board. It's just accelerated over the last few years. So it has gotten more mature, and it'll continue to get more mature and more sophisticated and better over time. The challenge here is whatever best practices we have today in terms of specific mitigations and specific ways of analyzing it are probably going to be out of date in, you know, in fairly rapid fashion. Anyone else?
Interesting. Yep. Anyone else?
I think from my perspective, I come at this from a quality and regulatory perspective, from compliance and submissions, and thinking about where we land today. I do think there's quite a bit of education and growth that needs to happen in the, let's call it, regulatory science or quality science part of this, right? And how do we take the models that we've been developing as computing technology has become sort of more separate from the device in many cases, and SAMD has become a more prevalent part of what we do. How do we really extend what we've learned about risks that this kind of separation creates, and apply that to the cloud in a more sort of robust way? Because again, as Bernard said, what we get here is great scalability, we get great reliability, but we get a more opaque box, right? We don't get to see inside of it very well. And that box changes a bit. And depending upon the provider and your service agreement, it can change a lot on a daily basis, or it can change very infrequently. And this brings a different paradigm to sort of designing devices for cloud deployment, ensuring that you understand their external dependencies and how they affect the device, doing mitigations early. And then how do we maintain a validated state once something is deployed out there? You know, doing real-time probes and testing of the environment to give you confidence that it still behaves in a way that you expect. And that's a little bit different, not a lot different, but it's a little bit different. It's an extension of our thought processes from before, but a level of opacity on that computing platform that you don't, that we traditionally haven't thought about when everything was in one package. So I think we've got a ways to go. And I think, I'll just be honest, I think the regulators are going to get more and more educated about some of the risks here as we make mistakes as an industry. And it pays to be a little ahead of the game and be thinking about if this is a way that your company's going to move, thinking about it ahead of time.
Yeah, maybe let me give a sort of a quick illustration of kind of the trade-offs that one might need to continue to make, right? A number of years ago, when people were looking at, as we are scaling up services, scaling down services, or orchestrating services that we might use on the cloud, as a way to mitigate those services malfunctioning, having some initial testing of the service, monitoring of the service, and a way to gracefully retire a malfunctioning service and replace that was a mitigation that you might need to do yourself. And then eventually we ended up getting some external software and tools that we could use for that, for what's called basically, self-healing services. Well, what's happened now is that self-healing that I described is now part of the underlying infrastructure. It's better than the mitigations that you could do yourself. So you can say, well, we can do these mitigations ourselves, but it's not going to be as good as these other ones. So do you do that and maintain control, or do you take these new and better, more integrated things and include them? That's kind of the trade-off that I think we're going to continue to have more and more of as the infrastructure gets more sophisticated.
If I could add, yesterday we were talking, it's kind of changed where when I first got into cloud computing, and it was actually not even called cloud computing, but it was sort of this hosted idea, and there was sort of still all these layers you were dealing with, and you still sort of saw the separation of the layers, the technology stack that was there. But increasingly, like in my example I showed you, it's all kind of gone in the background, and now it's just the app that you see in a lot of cases. Not all cases, but in some cases that you see. So it's more like, water coming to your house or electricity, it just is. And there's standards on what voltage it needs to be, and that there's quality set up, the water isn't tainted. So it's gotten to be, it's moving that way, and I can understand that people would be nervous for that. But I would say I used to show a diagram of a guy that was doing some do-it-yourself work at his house, and he rented a backhoe, and he took it and he dropped it into the ground, and he hit his gas line and blew up his house. And I think there's some of this stuff now, you're not going to be able to do it yourself as well as somebody like Salesforce or Amazon. You're just not, where you have to think about what business are you in, where you need to concentrate. And certainly I understand you have to have the risk and the mitigation stuff. I understand that completely, but they're able to invest in a lot of that stuff far more in a one-to-many model and shared across many customers than you'll be able to do yourself. And so that's, hopefully it gets more and more, and I've seen it in our space, people got more and more comfortable with it to the point where I don't really question my water unless it tastes bad. I guess maybe that's too late, but that's the difference.
This is Pat. That was interesting. One question that I had is, can we trust the cloud? I know that people trust my spreadsheet, that they have high confidence that the calculations inside of Excel are working correctly. Are we at that point when it comes to cloud quality?
Well, I wouldn't have picked spreadsheet for a trust, to be perfectly honest with you. There's a lot of, I think in the UK, there was a big thing on counting COVID cases with spreadsheet errors. So we see, auditors love spreadsheets. When they see them, they dig in and find out what's going on. So I wouldn't have used that maybe as an example. But we definitely have to earn our stripes. There's no doubt about it as an industry, I would say. I can understand, and some people like spreadsheets because they can do whatever they want with them. That's one of the things they like about them, and that is a strength of a spreadsheet, and they're sort of ubiquitous. Anybody could use them, so that's great. But we think a lot of things that are in a spreadsheet should be on a platform that's secured, that's backed up, that has change control on it, that can be reported with other data and seen, and it's got, you know, tracking on field change and all that stuff that, you know, real enterprise level apps have. So I'm a little nervous about spreadsheets, frankly.
Actually, I think there's actually a really good spreadsheet example, and this goes into the kind of, in some cases, because something is familiar, we make assumptions on it, and when really some of those we should validate to make sure that they're correct and that it's fit for purpose. So one of the things that was a bug in Excel was on certain types of mortgage type calculations, right? There's a particular type of calculation that was incorrect in Excel over a number of years. And since Excel was used in a lot of mortgage processing kind of work, it turned out there were significant, very, very expensive errors that crept into that in that industry as a result of that, and it was only discovered after years. So just because something is familiar does not mean that it shouldn't be validated. On the other hand, if you look at, you know, there was a point in time when Excel was a brand new thing. There was a time when mobile apps were a brand new thing, and certainly regulators for some early applications as they were submitted would ask questions and you know, return back and say, have you validated that someone can actually download this application off of the App Store? And companies actually needed to go validate that. Those aren't questions that are being asked anymore. So some of this is because in this industry, the cloud is relatively new. And so there are going to be greater questions about the details than there are with things that people are already more familiar with. You need to take the same level of rigor, you know, as you have with other things, and not make the assumption that it's somehow more dangerous, but also that, you know, not that it's less dangerous.
I think it's
interesting. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's really about, indeed, really understanding how we're using that specific cloud computing platform in your product. What is the role of that platform in your product, in your process, and what are the potential risks, right? So it really starts with understanding the implication of using that platform on a cloud, in a cloud environment, and what are the potential things that can happen and that may be different from a non-cloud software. And then, you know, understanding what is the worst case scenario, obviously, and the risks really related to that, and trying to find ways of, yes, validating the software as much as you can, but also have backup mechanism that you can have in place in case something goes wrong and you have no immediate correction that you can put in place. So you need to move to a backup plan or to a different tool or to, you know, a safe mode for your device.
I think to add to what Nicola and what Bob and others saying, you know, in general in quality, we look at a risk-based approach where depends what can go wrong, depends what the impact of that going wrong is, and even though this is a relatively new technology, it's still that principle, the underlying principle of looking at the risk and looking at the impact of particular failure modes that that we think of or don't think of is still what's driving the way we need to approach these types of things.
All right, thank you all for that. There was a comment talking about some other technologies. So I'm curious, is the cloud really different than some of the trends that are going on with other kinds of computing platforms? I mean, cloud is new, but how different is it from some of the other things that are going on?
I mean, I would say it's an extension of trends that have been going on for a very long time of more power and less control, right? At some point in the past, we had, we had a sort of single hard drive that we were storing data in, and you maybe didn't fully know where exactly things were being stored, but you knew it was going to be, on a particular hard drive, right? Then at some point, well, there could be hard drive failure and failure to write. So why don't we come up with something called, a RAID array, where the software is now controlling what data is being written, right? And you actually don't know where it is and how it's striped across these arrays. We've gotten something that is actually better, but we have less control and we have less knowledge of what's happening inside of that. The same thing has happened with all of these other platforms. Mobile apps, you have far less control over when there are operating system updates, all of those things. Those are just extensions of the same kind of more power, less control. The cloud and really this connected world, I think that we are in with the cloud as an integral part of the ecosystem, just accelerates that process. So, the question isn't how do we validate something and how do we keep everything from changing? How do we deal with the change that is inherent? That's a problem that we could sort of avoid facing because it wasn't happening that often, but in a connected world, it's happening, faster and faster and more in real time, frankly. So that's kind of the fundamental shift, I would say. It's made this a front and center problem as opposed to a problem that you could, solve with inefficient processes.
And I think to add to that, one of the ways that this manifests itself is in testing. If something is less transparent or it's just a different paradigm than we're used to, so it requires us to take a step back and say, we've always tested in a particular way, but maybe we really need to approach it a little bit differently, and think a little bit outside of the box when it comes to these new technologies. So I think that's one of the implications that we've been seeing in working through the issues around this consensus report.
Any other comments on this?
I think Bernard was kind of heading to it. It's cloud's sort of part and parcel. A lot of things that are happening, some of it gets folded into the service, but it's become one of the chains, the links in the chain. When you look at mobile computing, what's going on with that? So many cloud services connected to it, and the reduction in size on computing and devices, things talking back to home, the cloud's become one of those links in there, and it just all seems to they each seem to help each other, and rising tide floats all boats, and it seems to be doing that.
Yeah, and I think this is something that it's not just in medical devices, right? It's really in individuals' lifestyle. It's in how the world works, right? That is, and so especially with a lot of the potential value and innovation that is happening in the medical device space, things that are either implanted, worn, or in patient hands or connected to patients, these things need to be part of their lifestyles, and those lifestyles are mobile, connected systems. You know, there is no way of not addressing it and not dealing with it, unless you're in a very, you know, a niche somewhere in the medical devices where you can stay unconnected.
Yeah, I think the bandwidth side has played a big role in this. When I first got into before cloud, their big issue was internet connectivity for people. And now it's so much better than it was in the 90s, you know, as an example. If you use that as a timeline, and now we're getting 5G and other things. So hopefully that's more pervasive, and I'm sure some countries are still struggling, some rural areas, even in developed countries. So I think that's another thing that's making this whole thing pop. It's not just the computing world, it's also communications.
Yeah, I think that you know, Nicola had mentioned kind of the scenarios and what your backups are, and I think that's an important one to think about here. And I'd say almost abstracting a couple of things, right? One of them is, you know, there are risks inherent to distributed systems that you need to manage, whether the cloud is part of a distributed system or not. And so then, you know, one of the first questions is, should this be a distributed system? Or if it's a distributed system, what are our backups in case some aspect of that fails? A lot of those are things that are not specific to the cloud. They're more specific to, well, connectivity, using the internet, using cellular, et cetera, to different systems and subsystems that are distributed. And those are, you know, that's the first set of questions that should be asked. And then you take the cloud as probably the most useful way of doing back-end systems to have the sort of, you know, core central processing or communications hub. And then you look at the specific cloud related risks, which are aren't the same as the general distributed system ones. They're really more on the lack of visibility in terms of what changes are happening and what's going on underneath the hood, as it were.
Now, I noticed that we've been talking about the cloud generically and not about any specific provider. And I don't like to pick on or focus any one particular supplier, but I'm just curious what the panel thinks. You know, are there any differences between the major suppliers? Or are they all the same?
I should probably stay out of that one, but go ahead. and actually, I have a different angle to that probably, but I'd rather hear what the other folks say.
Yeah.
So I haven't done a thorough analysis of all the potential cloud vendors. Primarily, I've looked at and have worked with, you know, 3 of them that you can imagine, you know, who they are. And I think this is one of the things where the cloud has matured a lot. There were big differences, I would say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but they've become less and less. A lot of the services that people end up using are more commoditized and available in a very similar fashion with different cloud vendors. They're all investing a lot of money in that. But there are areas of differentiation on new services or wrinkles to those services, all of which are also designed to lock you in to a particular cloud vendor. But even in those cases, just because, you know, someone has maybe done certain things in AI that others haven't, 6 months later, they'll have caught up in that. So it is very difficult to sort of treat it as a, you know, as a, you know, categorical, these guys are good at this, these guys are good at this, these guys are good at that. They're all investing tons of money and sort of, you know, that changes over time.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I think there's some excellent providers out there now, right? And I do think the competition between them is really high. The differences are getting less and less. But one of the things that gets lost sometimes is to focus, and this is going to sound incredibly self-serving, but you can label me that, okay? But what applications do you need to run the business? What is it, the app that's going to talk to your device? Or what is the essential app that you really need to make your service happen? And to look at those applications, because I think there's less and less differentiation at the lower levels of the stack, as we call it, and how it's provided. There's certainly some differences, don't get me wrong, but I don't know that they're as important as the app that's going to run what you're trying to do. And sometimes I think people kind of get caught up in the data center side of it a little more than the what's the app do and what are the controls around that, and all the questions that were brought up earlier about change management, control, and all that. At the app level, that's so important, and that's what's going to separate one business from another, is that the apps. If you think about it, we're here talking about med devices, but you know what? We're all really software companies. And I look at things and say, which of these platforms are going to allow you to be a better software company for what you do? And there may be an app on it, or it might be a set of tools that are there, and which is one of the choices we made that we got with Salesforce. May not be the right thing for your company, but there's a set of tools that made sense for what we do there. That's one of the things I would stress people to take a look at is those things. It's the app, and what is the essential thing of your business that you need to do well.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think indeed that besides the functionality, the differentiators across different vendors, when you go to the medical world, it's also extremely critical, that you do your homework on the supplier you're gonna select, to have a look what their history is in terms of quality of what they provide, right? And how transparent their processes are to you, how much you can trust the vendors that is gonna be able to update, for example, the tools you're using without your consent, right? So it's always a good idea in general for suppliers, right? But especially when you're dealing with cloud software that can change and the vendor is able to apply those changes without your consent, you need to really be able to trust that vendor, right? So that's kind of a very important thing when you're selecting the supplier there.
This is Tom Mader. I hate to interrupt. This is a great discussion, but we're running over time, and we do need to have time for questions and answers. And both fortunately and unfortunately, we've got far more questions than we have time for. So let me run through some of them and ask you to be as succinct as possible in answering them so we can get to as many. The first one is sort of a big one. As reticent as you all are with the validation of spreadsheets, which have been around since the 1980s, why wouldn't we be more skeptical about the issues with validating the cloud? I'm extremely nervous about placing my software in the cloud.
I guess from my perspective, I would probably say healthy skepticism is reasonable.
Right.
This is a prove it, verify it industry, right? But what I think the panel would probably say is that in many cases the benefits, right, that we get, especially for the vast majority of our devices that are not high risk and do not have a lot of sort of detailed technical failure modes that relate to these computing platform dependencies, right? So there's the 80-20 rule. There's a lot of these things that this platform, the benefits far outweigh the risks, but that doesn't mean that there aren't situations where either because of the architecture of the product, the real-time or intended use is critical, that and its susceptibility to some of these external dependencies might make it inappropriate. And I think a reasonable approach at the time you're conceptualizing whether to deploy a device on the cloud is to think about those things and analyze them through risk analysis and see if you can mitigate them. So, it isn't a one size fits all. And remember, if it's a regulated device, you're going to be asked to prove it, right? You're going to be asked to prove that this thing is operating in a state of control, in a validated state, and that changes aren't going to cause failure modes that are going to affect the safety or performance of the device. So I'm with you. I just think that for the vast majority of devices, most of those risks can be mitigated.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to race through these. So let me get one answer to each question if I can. Is 62304 a valid process to assess possible failures of cloud components?
I think it's a tool that you can use. So in particular, how you handle kind of risk analysis with 62304, or how that applies software safety classification and software segregation. I think those are valid tools that you can use as part of that process. But anytime you get a system that gets more complex, there's a lot of devil in the details around that stuff. It's not necessarily easy when you have a very complex system.
I have two questions for Tom Brennan. What are the top 3 things you would advise the buyer to look for in a solution when shopping for an ERP solution?
Oh gosh, well, I think one of the things I touched on, I think a lot of companies need to think what are they about as a business and what's really important to them to do well. And sometimes, you get this whole, all the software vendors show up and they've got all kinds of things you can get lost, frankly, and everything that's being provided in front of you. So if you really understand what it is you need to do well, and then when you look at things like look at ERP systems, you'll have a more prioritized approach of what you want. Because the ERP systems are, while most of them have a lot of the same stuff, you will find pockets where different companies do well. And that's what you want to kind of line yourself up with, I think. So that would be one thing. The second thing is, I think, it's not just the software, it's actually the provider. It's someone who's trying to help you solve business problems and how you go about doing things. And it's something that's really important. It doesn't change with technology. It's still a people thing. And you want to know what the approach is to how somebody's going to be helping you solve your problems, not just for your initial implementation, and then as you go on. And then the third thing is, ERP's got just a terrible reputation for being hard to change. And in fact, I understand why people use spreadsheets, because they can just go do stuff. And in ERP, the older systems, it was hard. It was expensive, difficult, hard to upgrade. You couldn't upgrade, and you got stuck on releases. So why would you do that, right? So what's changing with the modern ones, and there's some people who are what I call cloud washing, taking an old product, putting it in a data center, calling it cloud. It hasn't changed. What you want to look for, I think, in the newer systems is flexibility. And there's a whole term and technology out there called low-code technology. And it's the ability of business users to do things themselves without having to go to an IT person. And a lot of companies just don't have the staff to do it, but they want a business person to be able to say, change a process, change an app. So those are the 3 things I would look for.
Okay, and a quick question, can companies use your solution if they don't already subscribe to Salesforce?
Yes, they can. Our product runs on Salesforce, so they get the platform part that supports our piece. They don't get CRM, sales automation, and marketing and cases and stuff. That's something they'd have to license separately from them. But they get the underlying platform, reporting tools, the ability to use the app exchange, all that stuff I mentioned earlier on.
A general question, are cloud service providers more attractive to cyber attackers? And how do you address security hacking attempts targeted to cloud activities?
I can take that one. I think the answer is yes. That has both advantages and disadvantages, right? One of them is because they are so big and clear targets, they see way more things than you would if you're just hosting your things in a data center. They see everything, they see the patterns. They also invest incredible amounts of money and effort to combat those things. So, you know, if you're the biggest economy and the biggest military power, you are going to see more of those things than a small country is. You're also going to be much better able to combat those things. So I think that's again, this is another trade-off kind of thing, but they're spending far more than any medical device company could to protect themselves and their customers, because that's their business. If they get hacked and if there are lateral types of issues, that hurts their business, whether it's a medical device company that's using that or a financial services company or a school.
What is your advice to a small or mid-sized cloud service provider that wants to expand to the medical device market but does not have the resources to go to a full-blown ISO 13485 certification? What are the top 3 things to implement that would be appealing to the medical device manufacturers?
So definitely, I'll say as change management is one of the hot topic when we talk about cloud computing platform. Then I'll say definitely a strong process around change control that you can show. You can show your users how you control changes and how you verify and validate the changes before you just deploy them to your users. Definitely a problem resolution process, like if your customer have an urgent issue that relates to the tool you're providing them with, they need to be confident that they can reach out to you fast and you're going to address their needs fast, especially if they're in a medical environment. There may be safety related issues, so you may need to give them priority and have a system there that can reassure them you're going to take seriously the things they're going to report to you. And yeah, I'll say maybe another thing, it's you need to be open to share with them those processes and make sure they gain the confidence that they need, that you are a supplier that can be trusted in their medical product. So I think being transparent and open to them and letting them examine those things is also very important in my opinion.
How often are updates pushed out? How long does revalidation take for those updates, and how much work is involved?
It is all over the place, frankly. And in a lot of cases, we really don't have good visibility into that. So a lot of this is actually more dependent on individual services and how mature the services are, rather than it's more service specific than vendor specific. So as with anything that is out there that's maintained by a large company, when you have something that's been running very stably for a long time and it's very mature, you probably have fewer updates to that than when it's a brand new beta service, let's say. Chances are you're probably not going to be running your applications on using beta services that aren't really fully mature yet. But that is one of the fundamental issues. In many cases, we don't know what's going on under the hood in terms of those changes. Very often, we don't have even the level of visibility that we have, say, with mobile operating systems, where patches, we may not have control over the patches, but we do know when a patch happens.
What should be the role of the service provider regarding client software validation requirements?
I think it might be a really interesting service to provide as a third party to provide software validation on a cloud platform. But I think generally speaking, it's not the service provider's responsibility to conduct that validation. I think really from my perspective, it's to support it, right? I think Nicholas said it perfectly. This idea of transparency and change control so that you can not only tell your customer, if you're a service provider, tell your customer what's going to change and when, but that they can self-serve that, right? They can go out and see what's going on, and the ability to sort of categorize that. Like there are certain kinds of things that a particular product might care about. Maybe it's libraries, maybe it's some other kinds of processing, availability, whatever. It can depend on the device, but that transparency, ability to self-serve and monitor, I think goes a long way. I wouldn't expect the general service provider to provide validation services.
Okay, well, we have quite a few more questions, but I'm afraid we're running out of time, and I would like to get to the wrap up by Joe Llewellyn, who's Vice President of Emerging Technologies and Health IT at AAMI. And actually, one of the questions, which Joe, maybe you'll address, somebody had asked whether there are any details on the consensus report available. So maybe you can give people an idea of where things go from here.
Sure, I would be glad to. First of all, before I start giving the details, I wanted to thank Veronica and everyone at MedTech Intelligence for putting on this webinar and allowing us to provide the information to people, but also allowing you guys to know about the work we're doing and what we're aiming for. And also, of course, I want to thank Pat and the entire pantheon of panelists and task group members. And finally, I want to thank Tom and Rootstock for sponsoring it. We are the AAMI consensus report is an initial consensus document that we are putting together to try to put some starting consensus around where we are on cloud computing and compliance issues. It is not the end of the road. It's not really the start of the road either. The start is probably the article that, as you heard, will be published, the peer-reviewed article that will be published next month in the AAMI Biomedical Instrumentation and Technology Journal. We do hope to have this consensus report, which involves the work of the task force to draft it, and then a review panel made up of experts from our quality systems activities. We hope to have that done by the first quarter of this year. That's always contingent upon the end of the first quarter of this year. That's always contingent upon there being consensus. We can't produce a consensus report until we actually get consensus, but I do think we're heading in the right direction. I'm very positive about that target. And that will last at least 12 months, 12 to 24 months, and we'll be constantly reviewing it. And it's very possible that it could lead to a more developed consensus document, an AAMI technical information report, an American national standard, or ultimately even an ISO IEC standard providing guidance or requirements around this issue. If you'd like to follow the work and find out how you can be involved in the current work and future work, I would be happy to speak with you. I don't see my email on this slide. It's my first initial and last name, jlewelling@aami.org, but I will also ask Veronica to make sure it's in the handouts. And I would be happy to talk with you about this work and exactly what the process is. It's a little more detailed than we have time for here. And also talk to you about the future plans on this, as well as other related issues like health software and IT systems and artificial intelligence and big data and more. So great, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank everyone. We're right at the end of the program, so again, I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions, but if you can communicate with the organization, is there a way to contact others on the working group, or should they just go to AAMI? What is the best way to contribute any additional questions or comments that they might have?
There should be a next slide here that has a email address.
Next slide, Veronica.
Okay, there it is. Good.
Okay, good. So you have a way to get in touch. So if there are questions that weren't answered, I apologize that we didn't have time, but we did get such a strong turnout of people for this program that they're just, we don't want to keep you all day. So I do want to thank all of our speakers and panelists for today's discussion. And I want to thank Rootstock again for sponsoring the program. And to do a bit of self-promotion, I should mention that we at MedTech Intelligence have a number of other virtual events during the coming months. We have a 2-day virtual conference on computer modeling and simulation in MedTech product development and submissions on January 27th and 28th. And for those of you whose companies also manufacture diagnostics, we have scheduled a comprehensive EU IVDR implementation conference on February 24th and 26th. And details on these and other programs can be found on our website at medtechintelligence.com. And I'm always interested in hearing about new topics for programs. So if there are other issues you would like to see discussed, please let me know. And I'm very happy to develop programs to address them. So we're exactly at 2:30. So with that, again, thank you, everybody. And that ends the program.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.